At my grandson's engagement dinner, my daughter-in-law laughed and called me the broke widow with the dollar store gift. I just smiled and placed the wrapped box beside the cake. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. Family celebrations used to mean something to me. They were supposed to be warm, safe, the kind of evenings where generations gathered around one table and forgot their differences for a few precious hours. That night, the Hawthorne Country Club ballroom glowed with golden lights and crystal chandeliers. Waiters carried trays of champagne between tables dressed in ivory linen. Everyone looked polished, expensive. And then there was me, a 71-year-old widow in a navy blue dress I'd owned for nearly 10 years. I had spent all morning wrapping my grandson Ethan's engagement gift by hand. The paper wasn't fancy. The ribbon came from an old sewing box I'd kept since my husband Walter was alive. But I tied it carefully anyway, because some things deserve care even when no one notices. When I arrived at the reception table, my daughter-in-law Vanessa looked at the small wrapped box in my hands and smirked. "Well," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "I guess thoughtful is cheaper than useful." A few people laughed softly. My son Daniel avoided my eyes completely. I felt the humiliation settle quietly into my chest. Heavy. Familiar. Vanessa stepped closer, sipping champagne. Honestly, Ethan's probably expecting real gifts tonight, not sentimental little garage sale surprises. I looked down at the box resting in my hands. Old-fashioned brown paper. Slightly uneven corners. Worthless, to them. "I'm sure he'll like it," I said softly. Vanessa smiled the way people do when they think they've already won. "Oh, I'm sure this will be memorable," she replied. She had no idea how right she was. I carried the box into the ballroom and quietly placed it on the long table beside the other engagement gifts. Most of them were enormous. Luxury espresso machines. Designer luggage sets. A silver wine cabinet taller than my kitchen. Refrigerator. Mine looked painfully small between them. I could feel people noticing it. Or maybe I only imagined they were. The string quartet played softly near the dance floor while servers moved through the crowd balancing tiny crab cakes and champagne flutes. Everyone seemed relaxed except me. I suddenly became very aware of my shoes. Sensible black flats polished so many times the leather had begun to crack near the toes. Vanessa floated from group to group like she owned the evening. Every laugh from her table sounded just a little too loud. At one point, I overheard her speaking to one of Ethan's future in-laws. Walter left Eleanor almost nothing before he passed. She whispered dramatically. She's been struggling ever since. Honestly, I feel bad for her. I nearly stopped walking. Walter had not left me with nothing, but I said nothing. There's a strange kind of humiliation that comes with being pitted by people who secretly look down on you. It settles slowly, like cold rain soaking through a coat. Daniel finally approached me near the dessert table. "You okay, Mom?" he asked without really looking at me. "I'm fine," I answered. He nodded too quickly. Vanessa doesn't mean anything by it. She jokes around. I looked across the ballroom at my daughter-in-law laughing beside the champagne tower. No, she meant every word. And somehow, the worst part wasn't her cruelty. It was watching my own son grow comfortable standing beside it. I stood near the back of the ballroom while the younger guests gathered around the bar, taking photos for social media. Nobody asked me to join them. That wasn't unusual anymore. Over the last few years, I had slowly become invisible at family events. Not completely excluded. That would have been easier to confront. Instead, it happened quietly. Little things. Small humiliations stacked on top of each other until they became impossible to ignore. Last Thanksgiving, Vanessa changed the dinner time without telling me. I arrived 2 hours late to cold plates and uncomfortable silence. The Christmas before that, she accidentally forgot to save me a seat beside the family table. I ate near the kitchen with 2 neighbors no one else wanted to sit with. And every single time, Daniel defended her. "She didn't mean it that way, Mom. You're being too sensitive. That's just Vanessa's humor." Humor. Funny how cruelty suddenly becomes a joke when nobody wants to confront it. I watched Ethan across the ballroom laughing with his friends. My grandson looked happy, truly happy. And for a moment, I wondered if I should have stayed home tonight. Maybe that would have made things easier for everyone. Then I remembered Walter. My husband used to say something whenever people underestimated others. Character shows up fastest when money enters the room. At the time, I thought he meant business. Now I understood he meant family too. Vanessa suddenly walked onto the small stage near the dance floor and tapped her champagne glass with a spoon. The room quieted almost instantly. "I think it's time," she announced brightly, "for Ethan and Claire to start opening gifts." A ripple of excitement moved through the crowd. And there, sitting near the center of the long white table, was my small brown package. Vanessa smiled when she looked at it. The kind of smile people wear right before they embarrass someone publicly. Ethan and Claire sat together beneath a wall of white roses while guests gathered closer to watch the gifts being opened. Large boxes disappeared first. A designer coffee machine, a weekend spa package in Napa Valley, an envelope containing airline tickets to Italy. Each gift earned applause loud enough to shake the crystal glasses on the tables. Vanessa kept the evening moving like a performance, smiling, laughing, making little comments after every box. "Oh, now that's useful. See, that's what young couples really need." Then her hand landed on my package. The room seemed quieter somehow. "Well," she said with a small laugh, "let's see Grandma Eleanor's mystery treasure." A few guests chuckled politely. I kept my hands folded in my lap. Ethan looked uncomfortable the moment he picked up the box. He knew, maybe not everything, but enough to sense what his mother was doing. "Mom," he muttered softly, "just open it normally." Vanessa smiled wider. "I am opening it normally." She held up the package between two fingers like it weighed nothing at all. The brown paper crinkled loudly in the microphone's speakers as she slowly unwrapped it for everyone to see. Inside was a small wooden box, old walnut wood, slightly faded around the corners. I saw Vanessa's expression immediately. Disappointment. Of course. To her, it looked cheap. "Antiques are fun," she said carefully, forcing another laugh from the room. Daniel stared down at his drink. He still said nothing. Vanessa lifted the lid, and suddenly, the smile disappeared from her face. Completely. The ballroom fell silent. Inside the box was not jewelry, not cash, not some sentimental trinket from an old widow nobody respected. It was a stack of legal documents, and resting on top of them was a handwritten letter in Walter's unmistakable handwriting. My late husband's final signature sat clearly at the bottom of the page. Even from across the room, I saw Vanessa go pale. For a few long seconds, nobody spoke. The soft music near the dance floor continued playing, but it suddenly sounded far away, muted, like the entire ballroom had stopped breathing at once. Vanessa quickly looked down at the papers again, then at Daniel. "What is this?" she asked quietly, not confidently anymore. Daniel stepped closer to the table, his face tightening the moment he saw my husband's handwriting. I recognized that look immediately. Fear. Ethan carefully picked up the letter resting on top of the documents. "Grandpa wrote this?" he asked. I nodded once. My grandson unfolded the paper slowly while every guest in the room watched. Walter's handwriting had always been neat and steady, even during his final months. "If you are reading this, Eleanor," Ethan read aloud carefully, "then some people in this family may have forgotten who built everything they now enjoy." The room became even quieter. Daniel lowered his eyes. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly, already defensive. Ethan continued reading. "The lake property, investment accounts, and company shares listed below were never transferred to my son. They remain under Eleanor's sole authority unless she personally decides otherwise." A sharp breath escaped somewhere behind the crowd. Vanessa's face lost all color. "No," she said immediately. "That can't be right." But it was. Every document inside that wooden box carried official seals, signatures, and dates. Walter had prepared everything almost 3 years before he passed away. Carefully, quietly, just in case. I remembered the night he sat beside me on our back porch swing, holding a cup of coffee in both hands. "Money changes people," he told me softly back then. "Sometimes it reveals them too." At the time, I thought he was worried about business partners. I never imagined he meant our own family. Vanessa suddenly forced a nervous laugh. "Well," she said too quickly, "I'm sure there's some misunderstanding here." I finally looked directly at her. For the first time all evening, she looked away first. The tension in the ballroom changed instantly after that. A few minutes earlier, people had been sipping champagne and laughing over wedding gifts. Now nobody seemed comfortable touching their drinks. Vanessa reached for the documents again, flipping through the pages faster this time. I could see panic settling into her movements. Small at first, then obvious. "These accounts," she whispered to Daniel. "Why didn't you tell me about these?" Daniel looked stunned himself. I didn't know, he answered quietly. And I believed him. That was the tragic part. My son had spent so many years letting Vanessa control every conversation, every decision, every family gathering, that eventually he stopped asking questions altogether. Ethan looked back at me from across the table. Grandma, Grandpa left all this to you. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. He wanted to make sure I was protected, I said. Vanessa suddenly straightened her shoulders and forced another smile for the guests. Well, of course Walter wanted to help Eleanor, she said loudly. We've always taken care of family. The lie hung in the air like smoke. Nobody answered her, because too many people in that ballroom had heard the comments she made earlier. Too many had watched her mock me before opening that box. An older gentleman near the front finally cleared his throat. I believe Walter built Hawthorne Logistics from a single delivery truck, he said carefully. I did, I answered softly. Right beside him. The man nodded slowly, almost respectfully. And just like that, the room began looking at me differently. Not as the poor widow in old shoes. Not as someone to pity, but as someone they had completely misunderstood. Vanessa noticed it too. That frightened her more than the documents ever could. The rest of the gift opening never recovered after that. People still clapped politely when Ethan and Claire opened another blender or set of towels, but the energy in the ballroom had changed completely. Everyone kept glancing toward me, toward the wooden box, toward Vanessa. I noticed how quickly people stopped laughing at her jokes. Funny how respect works when money enters the conversation. Vanessa stayed unusually quiet for almost 20 minutes. She sat beside Daniel with a frozen smile on her face, occasionally whispering something sharply into his ear. Daniel looked worse every minute. Finally, during dinner service, he walked over to my table alone. Mom, he said carefully, pulling out the empty chair beside me. Can we talk privately? I cut a small piece of salmon without looking up. We're talking now. He sighed heavily. Older suddenly. Tired. I honestly didn't know Dad left everything structured like this. I know, I answered. That seemed to hurt him more than anger would have. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The ballroom lights reflected softly against the wine glasses between us. Around the room, conversation stayed low and cautious now. Daniel rubbed his forehead slowly. Vanessa thought. He stopped himself. I finally looked at him. She thought I was weak. I said quietly. There's a difference. His eyes dropped to the table again. And right then, I realized something painful. My son wasn't cruel the way Vanessa was. He was something worse. Passive. He watched things happen. Allowed them. Excused them. And over time, silence became its own form of betrayal. Daniel swallowed hard before speaking again. Mom, are you changing the trust? I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate. Walter and I spent 43 years building our life together. We learned early that character matters more than charm. And tonight, character had introduced itself very clearly to everyone in that room. I haven't decided yet, I told him softly. But for the first time all evening, Daniel looked genuinely afraid of the answer. Dinner ended awkwardly after that. People tried to return to normal conversation, but the atmosphere never fully recovered. The ballroom felt smaller somehow. Tighter. Like everyone had suddenly realized they were witnessing something far more personal than an engagement party. Vanessa disappeared for nearly 15 minutes. When she returned, her makeup was perfect again, but her expression wasn't. I recognized that look immediately. Calculation. She approached my table carrying a fresh glass of wine and a smile that looked rehearsed. Eleanor, she said sweetly, I feel terrible if anything I said earlier upset you. I almost admired the speed of her transformation. A few hours ago, I was the embarrassing widow with the cheap gift. Now suddenly I was Eleanor again. I stirred my iced tea slowly. You seemed honest earlier, I replied. Her smile twitched for half a second. Oh, come on, she laughed softly. Families tease each other. Families. Such a convenient word when people want forgiveness without accountability. Vanessa pulled out the chair beside me before I could answer. You know how much we care about you, she continued quietly. Daniel and I have always wanted what's best for you. I looked at her carefully then. Really looked. The diamond bracelet on her wrist. The designer handbag resting against the chair leg. The nervous tension hiding behind her polished voice. And underneath all of it, fear. Not fear of losing family. Fear of losing access. You were planning to sell the lake house? I said calmly. Her face froze instantly. Only for a moment. But long enough. I don't know what you mean. You already spoke with a realtor in February. Now she stared at me completely silent. Walter had taught me something valuable during our marriage. People become careless when they assume you know nothing. Vanessa thought old age had made me blind. What she never understood was this: quiet people notice everything. Vanessa stood from the table a few minutes later and walked straight toward the balcony doors overlooking the golf course. Daniel followed her almost immediately. I didn't need to hear their conversation to understand it. Panic has a very recognizable body language. The ballroom slowly returned to its soft hum of silverware and polite conversation, but people kept glancing toward the balcony where my son and daughter-in-law argued in tense whispers behind the glass. Ethan eventually sat beside me. He looked embarrassed. Confused too. I had no idea any of this was happening, he said quietly. I know, sweetheart. He stared down at Walter's letter again. My parents said you were struggling financially after Grandpa died. I smiled faintly at that. After Walter passed, I stopped buying expensive things. I sold the luxury SUV. I moved into the smaller lake house instead of keeping the main estate. Vanessa interpreted simplicity as weakness. That was her mistake. There's a difference between being careful and being broke, I told him gently. Ethan nodded slowly. Then his expression changed. Wait, he said, lowering his voice. Is this why Mom kept pushing you to move into that retirement community last winter? I looked out toward the balcony where Vanessa stood with her arms folded tightly across her chest. Yes, I answered calmly. The silence between us lasted several seconds. She said it was because the lake house was too isolated for you. Ethan whispered. I folded Walter's letter carefully back into its envelope. No, I said softly. The lake house sits on 14 acres of shoreline property. Understanding settled across his face immediately after that. Not shock. Disappointment. The kind that changes the way you see people forever. Across the ballroom, Vanessa suddenly looked toward our table. And for the first time that night, she realized she was no longer controlling the story. About an hour later, guests slowly began leaving the ballroom. The excitement from earlier had disappeared completely. People hugged Ethan and Claire politely, collected their coats, and whispered quiet goodbyes near the exit doors. Nobody was laughing anymore. I remained seated near the corner table, finishing a cup of cold coffee while the staff cleared empty plates around the room. That was when Vanessa approached me one last time. This time, she came alone. No performance. No fake laughter. Just desperation hidden beneath expensive makeup. Eleanor, she said quietly, sitting across from me. I think we may have started off on the wrong foot tonight. I almost smiled at that. Tonight. As if the cruelty had only begun a few hours ago. I folded my gloves carefully into my purse before answering. No, I said softly. This started years ago. She looked down immediately. For a moment, I saw something rare in her expression. Not guilt. Regret that she had miscalculated. You have to understand, she continued carefully. Daniel and I were only trying to plan responsibly for the future. The future where you sell my home. I asked. Her silence answered faster than words could. I looked around the nearly empty ballroom. Half-melted candles flickered across abandoned tables. Wrinkled napkins. Wilted roses. Strange how quickly beautiful things can look exhausted. My lawyer will contact the trustees on Monday, I told her calmly. Her head snapped upward. What does that mean? It means nothing changes without my approval anymore. Fear spread slowly across her face then. Real fear this time. Not because she hated me. Because control was slipping away. Vanessa opened her mouth again, probably searching for another polished excuse. But I stood before she could speak. Walter used to tell me something whenever business negotiations turned ugly. The first person who panics usually loses. And as I walked toward the ballroom exit that night, I realized something very clearly. Vanessa was finally panicking. 3 days after the engagement dinner, Daniel came to the lake house alone. Rain tapped softly against the windows while I sat near the fireplace, sorting old photographs into boxes. The house smelled faintly like cedar wood and coffee, just like it had when Walter was alive. Daniel stood in the doorway for several seconds before speaking. You kept the place exactly the same, he said quietly. I slid another photograph into the album. Your father liked things simple. The truth was, Walter loved this house because nobody pretended here. No country club conversations. No polished performances. Just water, trees, and silence. Daniel looked exhausted. Not angry anymore. Just worn down. He finally sat across from me at the kitchen table, rubbing both hands together nervously. Vanessa's upset, he admitted. I almost laughed at the understatement. She thought the trust would automatically transfer to me after you. He stopped himself too late. After I died. There it was. Not cruelty spoken loudly in a ballroom this time. Just the quiet assumption that my life had already become temporary to them. I stared at the rain sliding down the windows. You were making plans for things that never belonged to you, I said calmly. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. The silence stretched between us. Then he reached into his coat pocket and placed a folded brochure on the table. Luxury Senior Living Residences. I recognized it instantly. The same retirement community Vanessa had been pressuring me to tour last winter. They already reserved a unit for me? I asked softly. Daniel said nothing. He didn't need to. I suddenly understood everything with painful clarity. The pressure to move. The comments about my age. The fake concern. None of it was about helping me. They were preparing space for themselves long before I was ever gone. And somehow, that realization hurt more than being called a broke widow ever did. A month after the engagement dinner, the trustees finalized the changes Walter had prepared years ago. The lake house remained mine. So did the shoreline property, the investment accounts, and my shares in the company Walter and I built together from a single delivery truck and a borrowed warehouse office. But that wasn't the real ending. The real ending came quietly one Sunday morning. I was sitting on the back porch wrapped in an old cardigan, watching sunlight move across the water with a cup of coffee warming my hands. Peaceful. Finally peaceful. Then I heard a car pull into the driveway. It was Ethan. Alone. He walked onto the porch carrying a small paper bag from the bakery near town. The same bakery Walter used to visit every Saturday morning before sunrise. I brought cinnamon rolls, he said with a nervous smile. For the first time in a very long while. The smile I gave back felt genuine. We sat together for nearly 2 hours talking about ordinary things. Fishing. Claire's wedding plans. His grandfather. Before leaving, Ethan looked out at the lake and said something I still think about. Grandpa understood people better than I realized. I nodded slowly. Yes, I answered. He did. Ethan hesitated before speaking again. I'm sorry for how they treated you. Not excuses. Not explanations. Just honesty. And somehow, that mattered more than all the legal documents inside that wooden box. After he left, I stayed on the porch listening to the water touch the shoreline. Walter had been right all along. Money never changes people. It reveals them. That night at the ballroom, they looked at my small brown package and decided it was worthless before opening it. Just like they did with me. And in the end, that told me everything I needed to know about them.